You could say that life is made up of a series of choices, each one paving the way for the next. Yet every now and then, one seemingly trivial decision can completely alter the course of everything. I never imagined that a simple invitation, asking an old friend to join us for dinner, would spark a sequence of events that would flip my world upside down. Perhaps you'll judge me, or maybe you'll understand. But this is my story, and I'm going to share it exactly as it unfolded. So let's start from the very beginning. Every morning followed a predictable pattern. I'd wake up in bed, feeling the warmth of David next to me, my husband, the man I've been with for the last decade. His breathing was always steady, calm, and somehow reassuring. Our home was a sanctuary for me, a place where I felt secure. But lately, despite this peaceful setting, an unsettling feeling had begun to grow within me, an awareness that something was missing. David had always been a good husband, caring, attentive, and, above all, dependable. But within this reliable comfort, in the midst of all this stability, a sense of emptiness began to take root. At first, I brushed it off, blaming it on everyday fatigue or the stress of work. But as time passed, it became clear that this feeling was more than just exhaustion. One evening, David came home with a bright smile, announcing that his old college buddy, Jason Cooper, was back in town and wanted to catch up. I remembered Jason well, a tall, self-assured guy with a contagious smile and a sharp wit. In college, he was always the life of the party, surrounded by friends and admirers. Although I agreed to meet him, a strange sense of foreboding settled in the pit of my stomach, one I couldn't quite put into words. When Jason arrived at our house, everything seemed perfectly normal. He greeted David with warmth, and soon we were all reminiscing about the good old days. But something shifted the moment our eyes met. It was a brief moment, but it left a lasting impression on me. His gaze lingered on mine just a little too long. I quickly looked away, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. That evening, we spent a lot of time together, David, Jason, and I, sitting around the table, sipping wine and talking. Laughter and conversation filled the room, yet deep inside, a sense of unease began to grow. I found myself increasingly drawn to Jason, his gestures, his way of speaking. A spark ignited within me, a long-lost excitement that I hadn't felt in years. As Jason prepared to leave, I, as usual, walked him to the door. He thanked us for the evening, but just before stepping out, his eyes met mine again. This time, his gaze lingered even longer, and I felt something in that look, pulling me in as if an invisible bond had formed between us, one that was impossible to ignore. I quickly averted my eyes, said goodbye, but his image stayed with me long after the door closed behind him. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake that evening from my mind. Every detail, every look and gesture from Jason played on a loop in my head. I tried to convince myself that it was just boredom or the monotony of daily life, but it didn't help. Deep down, I knew it was something more. A few days later, David casually mentioned that Jason wanted to get together again. My emotions were all over the place, part excitement at the thought of seeing him again, part fear of what might unfold. But I agreed. We met again at our house, and this time I paid even closer attention to his every move, every word. With each glance exchanged, with each conversation, the tension between us grew stronger, something that couldn't be ignored. Yet we both remained silent, as if afraid to disturb the delicate balance that kept us from crossing that line. I was at a loss. This attraction, this fiery passion that had started to stir within me, was something completely new, something beyond my control. I knew full well that it could lead to disaster, but I couldn't help myself. I was terrified, yet at the same time, I felt more alive than I had in years, as if something long dormant had finally awakened inside me. Even when Jason wasn't around, these feelings lingered. Every time I was alone, my thoughts drifted to him, and whenever I tried to talk to David, I was overwhelmed with guilt, even though nothing had actually happened yet. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time. That evening, I thought I could suppress my emotions, bury the growing excitement that was taking hold of me. But I quickly realized that desire isn't something you can control with logic. It becomes a part of you, clouding your thoughts and leading you to places you never thought you'd go. This is a story about how a desire that's born in the shadows of an ordinary life can start to dictate your every move. Several weeks had passed since Jason first showed up at our house. I tried to carry on as usual, convincing myself that it was just a passing crush, that nothing had really changed. But whenever I was alone, his image would surface in my mind. His smile, his voice, even the briefest touch, left a mark on my memory that I couldn't shake off. Our meetings with Jason became more frequent, and with each visit, the tension between us grew more intense. It was like a game of cat and mouse where we both knew the rules, but neither of us dared to make the first move. We avoided talking about the unspoken tension, but that only made it stronger. One evening, when David was late at work yet again, Jason unexpectedly dropped by. The moment I heard the doorbell ring, my heart skipped a beat, and when I saw him standing there, my pulse quickened. He stood at the door with his usual confidence, but there was something different in his eyes, something that made me freeze. "I thought you might be bored all by yourself," he said, lifting a bag of wine. "So I figured I'd keep you company." I knew I should have turned him away, but instead I invited him in. We sat in the living room, talking about the usual topics: work, friends, future plans. But every time our eyes met, there was an electric charge between us that neither of us could ignore. Jason started to open up about how difficult it was for him to return to this town after so many years, how he felt like a stranger in a place that once felt like home. His voice grew softer, and beneath his words, I sensed something deeper than just casual conversation. It felt like a confession, an admission that his heart was searching for something lost. "Sometimes I think I've missed out on the most important thing in my life," he said, his gaze locking onto mine, "and now I can't get it back." Those words stirred something deep within me. I knew exactly what he meant, but I was too scared to admit it, even to myself. My hands started to tremble, and I tried to hide it by gripping my wine glass tighter. But Jason noticed, and without saying a word, he moved closer. He slowly knelt in front of me, his face so close that I could hear his breath. "I can't pretend anymore that this is just friendship," he whispered, his voice carrying a determination that shattered the last of my resistance. "You feel it too, don't you?" I couldn't respond. My mind was a whirlwind, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Before I could say a word, he leaned in closer, his lips just inches from mine. I could feel his warmth, feel his breath mingling with mine, and I knew that this was the moment that could change everything. But I didn't let myself give in to that overwhelming feeling. With all the strength I could muster, I pulled away, stood up, and distanced myself from him, tears welling up in my eyes. Jason stayed where he was, his face a mixture of pain and understanding. He knew this moment was inevitable, but he also understood that the timing wasn't right, at least not yet. "I'm sorry," was all I could manage, avoiding eye contact. "Don't be," he replied calmly, getting to his feet. "It's not your fault." He left, and the silence that followed was deafening. I stood there in the living room, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading away, and I couldn't hold back the tears. It hit me then that this attraction, this burning passion, was very real. I knew I couldn't keep ignoring it, but I also understood that pursuing it could destroy everything David and I had built together over the years. Left alone, I felt two powerful forces warring within me: my deep love for my husband and the passion that had been awakened for his friend. I knew this was just the beginning, that the fire inside me would only grow stronger with time. But as for what to do next, I had no idea. The choice I'd eventually have to make seemed unbearable, and I had the sinking feeling that no matter what path I chose, I would lose something important. A few days passed after that evening when Jason and I almost crossed the line that could have shattered everything. I tried to push thoughts of him out of my mind, tried to return to my normal life with David, but it was impossible. Each morning I woke up with a gnawing sense that something was off, that a part of me was still stuck in that room where Jason and I nearly kissed. At work I was distracted, and at home I was tense. David didn't seem to notice, or maybe he just didn't want to. He was engrossed in his work, his own routines, and our relationship carried on along the well-worn path of habit. but beneath the surface, everything was different. The tension inside me grew with each passing day. Then one evening, just when I thought I might finally be moving past that encounter, the phone rang. Jason's name flashed on the screen, and my heart started racing again. I didn't know what he was going to say, but deep down, I already knew I wouldn't be able to resist. Hi. His voice was soft but resolute. I was thinking maybe you'd like to come over to my place. My first instinct was to refuse. It was too dangerous, too risky. But the memory of that night when we almost let ourselves go flooded my mind. I couldn't fight this feeling any longer. I agreed. When I pulled up to his house, my hands were trembling. I knew this decision could change everything, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Jason greeted me at the door with his usual confident smile, but I saw the same uncertainty in his eyes that mirrored my own. We walked into the living room, and I noticed how carefully he was observing me, as if he was trying to gauge my thoughts. But by then, I had already made up my mind. All my doubts, all my fears had faded into the background. I knew I wasn't here by accident. Jason moved closer, and I felt the warmth of his presence surround me. His hands gently rested on my waist, and I held my breath, feeling my heart skip a beat. At that moment, I couldn't hold back anymore. I pressed myself against him, and he leaned in, capturing my lips in a kiss. That kiss was more than just our lips meeting. It was an outpouring of all the passion we'd been holding back for so long. I felt his hands glide over my body, exploring every inch as if he wanted to commit me to memory forever. We moved to the bedroom, and it felt like the tension that had been building up all these weeks was finally being released. Jason gently laid me down on the bed, undressing me slowly, savoring every moment as if he was committing it to memory. His lips trailed soft kisses across my skin, and I couldn't suppress the moan that escaped as his hands began to explore my body. Each touch was like a spark igniting a flame, every caress an explosion of passion. It was as if we were becoming one, our bodies moving in sync, our souls intertwining. In that moment, time seemed to stop. There was only us and our overwhelming desire. I felt his movements quicken, the tension inside me reaching its peak. We were both on the edge, and at that moment, I knew I could never go back to the life I had before. When it was over, I lay in his arms, listening to his breathing slowly return to normal. My mind was blank, consumed only by the memory of what had just happened. I knew we had crossed a line, one from which there would be no turning back, but that no longer scared me. I felt a new life stirring inside me, and everything that had come before seemed insignificant. Jason gently ran his hand through my hair, and I looked into his eyes. There was so much warmth, so much tenderness in them that I felt my heart skip a beat all over again. We didn't need to speak. The silence between us was filled with more meaning than any words could have conveyed. I knew that we were now bound together, that this attraction, this passion that had blossomed between us would never fade. The next morning after my night with Jason, I woke up with a heavy heart. Everything that had happened left me with a tangle of emotions: guilt, shame, and a strange sense of satisfaction. I knew I had crossed a line, but I couldn't bring myself to regret it. The memories of that night kept playing in my mind, and every recollection of his touch, his kiss, made my heart race all over again. That morning, David was unusually attentive. It was as if he sensed something had changed, although I tried my best to act as if everything was normal. We had breakfast together, chatting about our weekend plans, but I found myself already looking forward to the next time I'd see Jason. At the same time, a wave of fear washed over me. What if David suspected something? What if he already knew? I spent the entire day on edge, trying to hide my emotions and avoid meeting David's eyes. But that evening, when David mentioned that Jason had invited us to dinner, I felt the ground shift beneath me. I didn't know how to react. Why had Jason suddenly decided to invite both of us? What was he planning? As we drove to Jason's place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap. Jason knew how uncomfortable I'd feel, knew how difficult it would be for me to pretend in front of David. But at the same time, I realized he wasn't doing this without a purpose. Maybe it was his way of showing that our relationship wasn't as deep as I thought. Or maybe it was all part of his game, one he was drawing both of us into. enjoying every second of it. When we arrived at Jason's house, I noticed my hands trembling. He greeted us at the door as if nothing had happened, wearing the same friendly smile he always did. I forced myself to smile back, though inside I was in turmoil. We sat down at the table and dinner began like any ordinary evening among friends. David and Jason talked, joked, and discussed various topics, but I felt a tight, invisible thread of tension between Jason and me, one that no one else could see but the two of us. At one point, when David was momentarily distracted, Jason caught my eye, and in his gaze, I could see exactly what he wanted to convey. This dinner was a test, and he was assessing whether I could handle it. But what struck me most was the certainty in his eyes. He had no doubt that I wouldn't betray him, that I'd continue playing this dangerous game right alongside him. After dinner, Jason suggested that David join him in his study to show him something interesting. They left, leaving me alone in the living room. I sat there, unsure of what to do, when suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. It was Jason. He came up close, leaned in, and whispered in my ear, "You're handling this better than I expected." His words made me freeze. I could feel his breath hot against my neck, and I knew he was playing with fire, but I was powerless to stop it. Jason's hand glided gently down my back, and I felt my nerves tighten like a coiled spring. In that moment, I realized he was savoring this game, taking pleasure in the risk. But before I could respond, we heard David's footsteps. Jason quickly stepped back, resuming his usual demeanor. I looked at him, and he simply smiled as if nothing had happened. When we got home, I felt utterly drained, as though I had just endured some kind of ordeal. But instead of feeling relief, I kept replaying that dinner in my mind, every word, every glance. I knew the game had become even more perilous, that now Jason was not only testing me, but also pushing his own boundaries. That night was filled with unease and turmoil. I lay in bed next to David, listening to him sleep peacefully, but I couldn't find any rest. Inside me, two powerful forces were at war: guilt and the overwhelming desire to continue. I knew this path led nowhere good, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back. Several days had passed since our last dinner at Jason's place. I tried to act normal to hide my feelings, but inside everything was in turmoil. Each day I woke up with a sense of dread, fearing that David might suspect something, but he seemed oblivious, and I clung to the hope that it would stay that way. That day began like any other. David left for work, I went about my usual errands, and nothing hinted at the trouble that was brewing. But that evening, when I returned home, I was met by an oppressive, tense silence. My heart started racing, but I tried to ignore it. David came home later than usual, his face grim, his eyes cold and distant. He barely looked at me, answering my questions with curt, monosyllabic replies. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. Finally, later that evening, as we both sat in the living room, he took out his phone and handed it to me. "Can you explain this?" he asked, his voice steely and unwavering. I froze. The phone screen displayed an app I'd been using to exchange messages with Jason. My heart skipped a beat as I saw our messages, short but unmistakable. I never imagined David would find them. I couldn't comprehend how this had happened, but as I looked at the screen, the truth hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd been using an old tablet David had given me long ago when he bought himself a new one. That tablet had always been with me, and I never thought anyone else could access it. But as it turned out, the device was still synced with his account. Every message, every photo Jason and I exchanged had been automatically saved to the cloud, which David could access. My world turned upside down. I had no idea what to say. How could I possibly explain this? How could I justify myself? But no words came to mind. I just stared at the screen, feeling the world around me crumble. "Do you have anything to say?" David's voice was as cold as ice. I looked up at him, and in his eyes, I saw not just anger, but deep, raw pain. He knew everything. I felt a knot tighten inside me as I realized there was nothing I could say or do to change what had already happened. I, do- I started, but the words caught in my throat. My mind was spinning. How did it come to this? How had I not noticed the signs? How could I have been so reckless? David didn't wait for an explanation. He already knew the truth. His question was more rhetorical, a bitter desire to hear me try to justify myself, to see how far I'd go with my lies. "How long?" he asked, his voice softer but no less menacing. "A few weeks," I whispered, feeling tears sting my eyes. David leaned back in his chair as if I had just plunged a knife into his chest. I watched as his face contorted, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. His hands clenched into fists, and I could see he was struggling to keep from exploding. The silence between us was suffocating, filled with the weight of everything that had just unraveled. "How could you?" he finally asked, his voice trembling, with not just anger, but a crushing sense of disappointment. I lowered my head, unable to meet his gaze. All I could do was silently acknowledge my guilt. I had destroyed everything we had built, and I knew he would never be able to forgive me for this betrayal. David stood up abruptly, his movements sharp and deliberate. He walked to the door, opened it, and shot me a look filled with nothing but hatred and contempt. "Get out of my house," his words struck like a physical blow, "right now." I stood up, feeling as though my entire world was collapsing around me. I gathered my things, moving past him without meeting his eyes. He said nothing more, simply closing the door behind me with a finality that echoed through the silence. I found myself standing alone on the threshold of what was once our home, but no longer felt like mine. Everything I had was gone in an instant. I had lost it all, and the worst part was knowing it was entirely my fault. When we make mistakes, we rarely comprehend how deep the consequences will run. I thought I could manage the situation, that I could keep everything under control. But as I stood alone on the doorstep of our house, I realized that I hadn't just lost my husband, I had lost everything that truly mattered to me. I stood there, the cold wind brushing against my face. The suitcase in my hand felt impossibly heavy, as though it contained the full weight of my mistakes. The door slammed shut behind me with such force that I flinched. It wasn't just the closing of a door, it was the end of an entire chapter of my life. It was dark outside, and I had no idea where to go. My mind was blank, and all I felt in my heart was a void, an overwhelming emptiness and pain. Every path seemed to lead nowhere, and I stood there, paralyzed by uncertainty. The only thought that flickered in my mind was Jason. Almost instinctively, I pulled out my phone and dialed his number. The ringing seemed to go on forever until finally, his voice came through on the other end. "Hello?" Jason's voice was calm. "Jason," I began, but my voice was hoarse from crying. "I need to talk to you. David found out everything. He kicked me out." There was silence on the other end of the line. I expected Jason to offer support, to say something comforting, but instead I heard a heavy sigh. "I don't think that's a good idea," he finally said, his voice cold and distant. "You understand there could never be anything serious between us." My heart stopped. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had just lost my husband, my home, and now Jason was telling me that there could never be anything between us. "But you," I began, but the words caught in my throat, unable to form. "You knew from the start this was just a fling," Jason continued, and his words hit me like a series of blows. "I can't let this ruin my life." I stood there utterly stunned. All my illusions, all my hopes crumbled in an instant. Jason had been my lifeline, my hope that after everything, I wouldn't be alone. But now I realized I had been nothing more than a toy in his hands, a temporary distraction he indulged in for a while. "I'm sorry," his voice was detached, as though he were discussing something trivial. "I can't help you. I hope you find a way out of this situation." He hung up, leaving me standing in the darkness, completely drained. I held the phone in my hand, unable to process what had just happened. In one day, I had lost everything: my husband, my home, and my hope for a new beginning. Now, I was left alone with the weight of my mistakes and no idea where to go next. I wandered down the street directionless. The world around me felt cold and hostile, and I couldn't find a place where I could feel safe. I walked, oblivious to the passers-by, not even realizing how my steps had led me to the place where I had spent so many happy years with David. Our home, which was now someone else's, seemed like an unreachable fortress. I stopped at the familiar park where David and I used to walk, and I sat down on a bench. I watched the people passing by, unable to comprehend how they could seem so calm while my world was falling apart. Tears streamed down my cheeks, and I didn't even try to hold them back. All my life, I had sought stability, security, and now I found myself standing in the ruins of my hopes. I had lost everything that mattered to me and was left alone, without support, without a foundation. I knew this was the price I had to pay for my mistakes, for my betrayal, but that knowledge didn't make it any easier. I felt my strength ebbing away, and I didn't know how I would cope with this. Time seemed to drag on, as if the world itself had slowed down. I tried to gather my thoughts, tried to think of what to do next, but nothing came to mind. I was lost, and the fear, the uncertainty was unbearable. I sat on that park bench, and it felt as though the world around me had vanished. The passers-by, the city noise, the wind, everything seemed distant, unreal. My mind was engulfed in chaos, and I couldn't find anything to hold on to. Everything I had was gone in an instant. I lost David, lost Jason, lost the home that had been my refuge for so many years. Now, only emptiness stretched out before me. I tried to understand how I had ended up in this situation. My thoughts drifted back to the day I first felt that pull toward Jason. What was it? Boredom, a craving for something new, or just a reckless mistake? I knew that at some point I could have stopped, could have chosen a different path, but I didn't. Why? The question haunted me, and the more I searched for an answer, the deeper I sank into despair. The tears continued to flow, and I made no effort to stop them. Everything I had done had led me to this moment. I had betrayed David, the person who loved and trusted me more than anything in the world. I had destroyed everything we had built together for the sake of a fleeting infatuation, for something that seemed real to me but turned out to be just an illusion. My heart ached as if it had been ripped apart. The sorrow and pain filled me from the inside, leaving nothing but an unbearable emptiness. I knew I deserved this emptiness. It was the price I had to pay for my mistakes, for my weakness. I recalled the moments when David was by my side, when we laughed together, made plans for the future. Now, those memories felt so distant, as if they belonged to another life, a life that was gone forever. I realized I hadn't just lost a husband, I had lost my sense of self, my future, and the confidence that I had a place in this world. Jason had been my escape, a way to run from the monotony, from what I had deemed dull and predictable. But now I saw it for what it truly was: self-deception. He was never someone who could replace David. He was merely a reflection of my own weakness, my fears, and my insecurities. And now that he was gone, I was left utterly alone, without any support. I tried to find strength within myself, tried to figure out what to do next, but nothing came to mind. I was shattered, broken, and couldn't find even a glimmer of hope. All I had left was the past, which now felt unreachable. I wished I could go back, fix everything I had done, but I knew that was impossible. Hours passed as I sat in that park, lost in my thoughts. People around me came and went, but I remained rooted in place, unable to move. I knew I needed to move forward, to seek a new beginning, but I couldn't summon the strength. All I felt was pain and emptiness, and I had no idea how to cope with it. Finally, as the sky began to darken, I stood up and started walking aimlessly. My feet carried me through familiar streets, but my mind was in turmoil. I passed by our house, which now felt foreign to me, and my heart ached with renewed pain. It was once a place of happiness, but now it stood as a symbol of my downfall. I wandered on, not knowing where I was headed. There was no plan, no goal in sight. I walked because stopping would have hurt even more. I was trying to escape my thoughts, my past, but I knew that was impossible. All I could do was keep walking, hoping to find something, anything, that might fill this emptiness. I didn't know how long I had been wandering the city streets. I felt lost, as if the entire world had turned its back on me. But deep down, I understood that it was I who had turned my back on the world, and now I was paying the price for it. I longed for forgiveness, for a path to healing, but I knew that journey would be long and difficult. When I finally stopped, I realized I was standing on a familiar bridge. It was a place where David and I often walked on weekends. I approached the railing and looked down at the river flowing slowly beneath me. The water seemed as calm as it had been the day we first came here together, but now that calmness only deepened my pain. I stood there, feeling the wind brush against my face, and I realized this was the end of everything I had known, the end of the life I had built. And although I was scared, I knew this was the beginning of a new path. I didn't know where it would lead me, but I knew I had to walk it to find new meaning in my life. I want you to know, don't make the same mistakes I did. Cherish what you have, and don't let fleeting desires destroy your life. Love, trust, and loyalty are irreplaceable. I learned this lesson too late, and now I am left to live with this bitter truth.